Hey everyone, this week we're going to take a little bit of a break from our usual programming where we have guests on to have a conversation about a topic that's really important for everyone but not necessarily the most fun: taxes.
Woo!
We'll go over what you need to know about filing taxes, what to expect from the process, and how to get your taxes done without a lot of hassle. And after listening to this episode, our hope is that you'll have a better understanding of the tax filing process and feel more at ease this tax season.
Yeah, so welcome to The Good Guide to Business, a podcast presented by the Better Business Bureau.
The Good Guide is all about conversations with businesses, organizations, and local leaders who are going above and beyond to make our community a better place.
So grab a cup of coffee, sit down, and get ready for this episode's exciting topic: taxes. So as you may have known, the IRS has already started accepting and processing taxes for the 2023 year. It's something that people should be looking at right now if you haven't started. Because this is coming up. The deadline to file your taxes is Tuesday, April 18th. And of course, there's a lot to do. There's a lot to talk about. And our hope with this episode is whether you're a business owner looking at ways to file taxes for your business. Maybe you just started a business, or maybe you're just another one of our listeners. You're interested in these topics. We have plenty of tips for you, no matter who you are, to help you with taxes this season. So the first thing I want to dive into really is how to find a trustworthy tax preparer. So maybe you have some complicated returns, or you're a business owner and you need help with doing your returns. A lot of people are turning to these tax preparers now. So there's a lot of different kinds out there, more than I was previously aware of. And
Me too.
yeah, there's a lot that you need to look at when you're choosing the right person for you. The first one we're going to talk about here is someone who's called an enrolled agent or an EA. Can you talk about what those kinds of tax preparers can do for us?
Sure, yeah. So an enrolled agent, an EA, is a tax preparer that's been approved by the IRS to represent taxpayers. They have to have a prior qualifying employment with the IRS or pass this intensive 2-day exam on federal taxation, and they have to have a background check. So that ensures that they have, a certain level of education and experience, and that they have a clean background check. To maintain that status, they have to have a certain number of credit hours each year in continuing education, so you can pretty much be ensured that they're going to be up to date on the stuff they need to know about taxes in order to file yours properly. An EA is a good option if you have a more complex tax situation, but you'll want to make sure that their area of expertise matches with what your personal situation is, because not all of them are going to be created equal, and they're going to focus on different situations. So that's something you need to keep in mind for them.
Yeah, that makes sense. And now another one I want to talk about is probably the one that people talk about the most, and that's the certified public accountants, or CPAs. So if you're going to be hiring a CPA, what can a CPA do for you, and why should you consider looking at one?
So CPAs, yeah, that's probably the one people have heard of the most. That's a certified public accountant, and those are the ones that went to college for this. Or they can have equivalent work experience, but normally they went to college, and they have their license after passing the state professional qualifying exam. They're usually highly skilled in accounting. They also make good candidates for complex tax planning and preparation. They're also enrolled in continuing education programs, so that is a similar thing to an EA. If your return is really complex, that can be a good option, but they charge more than basic tax preparers.
That makes sense, yeah. Now, let's say you need even more work done than maybe a CPA or an EA. People, I hear, they turn to these tax attorneys sometimes for this kind of stuff. What can tax attorneys help you with?
So tax attorneys are usually for the most complex situations. If you think you're going to need an audit, estate planning, advice on municipal bonds, that kind of thing. That's what you'd want a tax attorney for. They also charge the highest fees of all the forms of tax preparers, so keep that in mind also. But it's like sheltering you legally is part of what they do. So that can be like a good option if that's something that you need.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like, a pretty high step up there to need a tax attorney. What about these non-credentialed tax preparers? They sound probably a little more casual than a tax attorney. What can they do for you?
So non-credentialed tax preparers, that's probably the most common one. There's a lot of them in the United States. You don't have to have a lot of qualifications to become a non-credentialed tax preparer. They usually only work part-time during tax season. These preparers, they have to have a PTIN, a preparer tax identification number. But beyond that, their tax preparation skills are only regulated at the state level, not at the federal level, not by the IRS. So in a lot of states, you really only have to have that PTIN, and you don't have to like take an exam, you don't have to have a license, and there's really not a lot of other regulations. So the skills, the experience, and the education that they have on taxes varies like super greatly. You kind of have to rely on reviews, on getting recommendations from people that you know, and that sort of thing. You can really end up with someone that like doesn't know what they're doing if you're not careful. So it's kind of up to you when you're using a non-credentialed tax preparer to do your own research before you choose them.
Right, and I feel like that's just an important tip to keep across the board. Whether you're working with a non-credentialed tax preparer, something that's pretty low risk, but also, right, if you're choosing someone like a tax attorney, you also need to look into reviews on them and see these other things. There's a lot that goes into choosing the right preparer for you, and I understand we have a lot of great tips to share on that as well. The first thing I want to start with is these credentials, right? Obviously, there's a lot that goes into it. So how important is it to review these credentials when choosing a tax preparer?
Yeah, so even if you're choosing the tax attorney, the CPA, or just an uncredentialed tax preparer, you always want to check up like you were talking about. You don't just want to take their word for it, because they could even be pretending to be an EA or a CPA and not actually have those credentials. So those are things you should ask about ahead of time. You want to make sure that they're legitimate, and even if they are a CPA or an EA or a tax attorney, like look for reviews, because some people may have not had the greatest experiences with them in the past, and your taxes is probably not the time to choose someone that like you're not sure about. You want to be definite and sure that it's someone that you can entrust with this aspect of your finances.
Right. Yeah. No, I think, when doing taxes, it's especially important to look out for scams just because of the amount of money that's involved with doing tax returns and the amount of personal information, right? When you file your tax return, you're basically giving the IRS everything.
Right. Yeah. So like this is probably the most common with uncredentialed tax preparers just because they can get away with it. Scammers can get away with pretending to be them the most, but like spectacular promises, like anyone that's going to promise you bigger refunds than with your competitor, you should stay far away from them, because like first of all, they shouldn't be promising you any amount of refund, especially before looking at your taxes. Like that's just not realistic. And that goes for making sure that you have all their fees, all their policies about how they handle taxes, depending on what your situation ends up being like, in writing prior to paying for services with them and agreeing to giving them your information, because you don't want to be in a situation where someone claims they can get you all these benefits and then in the end your taxes might not even be done properly, or your refund is not what you hoped it would be, or they add on all these like shady fees after the fact that you didn't know about, and then you're kind of just out of luck.
Yeah, right. Oh gosh, there's so many ways this could go wrong, right?
I know. On top of being worried that your taxes aren't done right, and then you have to worry about like the IRS.
Right. Yeah. So again, it sounds like you have to be as careful as possible. And going along with that, how important do you think it is to get referrals when choosing a tax preparer?
I think that can be a great way to make sure that it's someone that is going to do right by you. Like you can look on reviews online, that can be great also, but if you know someone personally that you trust that has had a good experience with a tax preparer in the past, that's a great way to ensure that they're going to do the same with you, that you can make sure that it's someone you trust has given you this recommendation, therefore the person must be pretty decent. So
True. Yeah, definitely. And then also when finding a tax preparer too, how important is it that they have availability throughout the year to help you? Is this something that you should be concerned about, or is it just, you need this person for, this one thing or this 1 month during tax season to help you out?
That's another thing about uncredentialed tax preparers that work just during tax season. If something happens later, like if there's something wrong with your tax forms or the IRS decides to perform an audit based on your tax forms and what you submitted, like you could be in trouble if you can't get a hold of that person anymore. So you want to make sure ahead of time that they're going to be around when the time comes if you need that help, and also that they're not going to be way too busy. Like if they're taking on a ton of clients and they like barely have the time to help you during tax season, like you probably wouldn't want to pick that person, because you want to make sure that they're going to be there to help you, and that that's a question to ask. Make sure that they will be willing to help you when that time comes.
Good, yeah. Now, when filing taxes, a lot of people turn to these websites and programs to help them out. Always think of like TurboTax and these other services too, but I've been hearing a lot of buzz about this IRS free file, where you can supposedly go in directly to the IRS and file your taxes. Is that something that's legitimate? Is this something that we consider to be valid, or is this a scam?
So IRS Free File is on the IRS's website, and you can find it through going to irs.gov and search for their tax stuff. It's on a lot of their pages that talk about taxes. So you can go to that page and you can choose the IRS Free File, which is a guided tax preparation system for people that make $73,000 a year or less. For this year. It's probably going to change next year, and it was probably different the year before. But there's also like a system of forms you can use that's not the same thing as IRS Free File, but it's not as guided. You have to fill them out by yourself and like do your own calculations and that kind of thing. But that can be really helpful for first-time filers, lower income filers. It can be a great free option, so you don't have to use something like paying for TurboTax or paying a tax preparer.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a great, easy-to-use resource, and, it's right through the IRS, too, so that could alleviate a lot of the worries that people have with whoever they're hiring to do their tax preparing or whatever service they're using.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Most tax preparers are going to be legitimate and competent, but as with every system in the world, as with every industry, there are going to be people trying to scam you out of money. So it's always a good idea in every field of anything that involves giving your money to someone, but especially when it comes to your taxes, since that involves a lot of personal information, to just be careful and make sure you do your research and don't pick someone, don't wait until the last minute, because then you're going to be shuffling to try to find a preparer that can do it at the last minute. And that's when you're more likely to fall victim to someone who's trying to scam you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so I guess that leads right into the next topic, so we can talk about scams next, since unfortunately there are a lot of scams that relate to tax season and taxes in general.
Right.
Yeah, and they come about year after year. They're not getting any better. If anything, they're just getting more common. And the main theme that we see with scams most often is scammers posing as the IRS, as the Internal Revenue Service, and trying to trick people into paying them, saying they owe money to the IRS, or sharing personal information by pretending to be the IRS and asking for that information. So, Nick, can you talk to us about these types of scams and what people should look out for?
Yeah, well, first off, these types of scams can be really dangerous because it plays perfectly into how scammers operate, with creating this sense of fear and this sense of urgency, right? When the IRS calls you, like they do in these scams, right? They're saying that things like, hey, you owe back taxes, and if you don't pay us back, we're going to lock you up, or we're going to fine you with these really heavy fines, right? That really makes people afraid, and it makes them want to act now without thinking.
Yeah.
That's only part of the reason why these are so dangerous, right? As we just mentioned too, there's so much money involved with taxes and so much personal information as well. You got to remember that personal information is basically like money to these scammers, and the more they can get out of you, the better. So things like your social security number all the way down to your home address, which are all things that you need for your tax return, scammers can get through these scams. So again, a lot of the ways that they start too is, the scammers reach out to you pretending to be the IRS, and they're saying that they need you to either pay them with something like a prepaid card or a wire transfer to fix whatever error there is on your tax return. Maybe sometimes, too, they're targeting these college students, claiming that they owe what is called a federal student tax that has not been paid. Of course, that doesn't exist. But when you have somebody claiming to be the IRS contacting you, you may not even be thinking about that.
Yeah.
And again, because there's so much money involved in these tax scams, they're often very intricate. So we see time and time again, these scammers will spoof phone numbers to make it look like they're coming from Washington, D.C., or they'll spoof the number to make their caller ID come in as the IRS, right? So that's just even more ways that they can make it look more legitimate and scare you into paying them pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fear around filing your taxes, at least in like the young people, because I hear that from my friends all the time, and it stresses me out because you're worried about, is the IRS gonna think I did it wrong and like audit me and
Right.
But then when you put scammers just love to take advantage of that. I feel like every type of scam that we encounter at the BBB just comes down to fear most of the time. Fear
Exactly.
or love, but strong emotions regardless. And when it comes to taxes, that can be a huge thing because tax filing is so complicated and you're so afraid of doing it wrong that those two things combined really just leave you vulnerable to scammers.
Right. Yeah. I'm really glad you brought up the fact that, it's something that really stresses out young people in particular. I know I just filed my taxes and I was really stressed out doing the whole thing. But scammers, of course, know that. And that's why, young people ages, I think, 18 to 24, they're one of the most scammed demographics now because of that reason. That scammers don't think that we're familiar with the world. And a lot of times, we just aren't. So with situations like filing your taxes, I think it's especially important for young people to be on the lookout at these scams. Just a little anecdote here. I went to NC State, go Pack, and my freshman year, there were these cases where students at NC State, seniors at NC State actually, ended up losing tens of thousands of dollars to IRS scams. It happened when scammers spoofed the number of campus police and called these students and said, hey, we've been in contact with the IRS. You owe money on your taxes. We need you to grab these gift cards right now, read off the numbers, and fix this, really. Mm-hmm. And you would think, of course, NC State, these are smart kids, right?
Yeah. Fear is strong.
Incredibly strong to make these really smart college students fall for something like this. They were really making them afraid of something. And, of course, it's taxes.
That's a great example, though, because I feel like people assume that scams really only take victims that are, that could never be me. It's only people that are really old or really young or just really naive or whatever. But it happens to the best of us, and it happens to college students. It happens to regular adults all day long. And like you mentioned, the demographic that gets scammed the most are young people, not even older people. So you really just have to be careful. Even if you think that you're immune because of who you are as a person, it's just not necessarily true.
Exactly. And did you just imply that NC State students are the best of us?
No, oh my God, that's not what I meant. I went to UNC Chapel Hill, just so we're clear about which one in the room is better. That's fine.
Oh,
Whatever.
okay.
I didn't say anything about, listen, you're the one that was trying to bring NC State into the conversation.
Well,
I didn't mention anything about Chapel Hill.
I just wanted to point out how these scams can happen to
No,
anybody.
that is a really good example. It's actually a perfect example of why you shouldn't think that you're too good to be scammed, because I feel like that's if you're not careful and you're not looking out for them, that's exactly when you can fall for them. So you really have to be on your A game.
Oh, yeah.
Do you want to talk about tips for how people can avoid getting scammed in relation to their taxes?
Sure, yeah, let's dive into that. So probably the best way to avoid tax identity theft and avoid any sort of tax-related scam is to, again, file as early as you can. If you're listening to this episode, watching this episode, as soon as you're done, start filing your taxes. I'm not even joking. The sooner you file, the better, because A, you avoid scammers, B, if you're going to get a sweet return, right, you get that sooner if you file sooner. So it's a good idea to file as soon as you can, but don't rush it. Of course, you need to make sure you're doing it right, and you need to make sure you're doing it with somebody you can trust.
Well, that's another reason to not wait until the last minute so that you have time to not rush. If you're trying to do it on like April 17th, you're probably going to be trying to rush to get it done on time.
Exactly, yeah. If you're doing it April 17th, you're either rushing your information and you may be filing a bad return, or you're hiring Joe Schmo to do your taxes and he's going to take all your money and sell where you live to his scammer friends.
Hopefully no one named Joe Schmo is listening to this because he's going to be upset.
I'm sorry if I offended any Joe Schmoes out there. Another great thing to keep in mind, too, is see if you can get what is called an identity protection PIN. That's, an IP PIN when you shorten it down. And so to get that, you contact the IRS directly and ask them to get this. And what this PIN does is it's an extra level of protection to when you're logging in to do anything really that involves your taxes. It will ask you for this IP PIN. And, if you protect it like you should be the only person that knows what that PIN is. So it's just a great extra level of security to have when doing your taxes, when really you're trying to access anything that has to do with your taxes. It can help with that. It's also important too to keep in mind that there's a lot of rules that govern ways that government agencies can reach out to you. And of course, that includes the IRS. So you should really always know that the IRS never will initiate contact with taxpayers by email, text message, or social media. If you see somebody reaching out to you one of those ways, claiming to be the IRS, it's a giant red flag because they cannot do that.
If the IRS is trying to DM you on Instagram, it's probably not the IRS.
No, definitely not the IRS, and you should hit that report button because they're probably reaching out to other people too. Keep in mind that, and also if you have any questions whether this communication from the IRS is legitimate or not, give them a call and they can answer that for you. The number for the IRS is 1-800-908-4490. Again, that's 1-800-908-4490. So if you have any questions about your taxes, or if you think this communication from the IRS is a fraudulent communication, or if you're questioning if it's actually them, you can reach out to them directly and they should be able to help with that too. And then again, if you are filing your taxes online, it is so important that you make sure that it's with a legitimate organization and you're on a safe website. So do some internet research, do a quick Google search of this company that you're filing your taxes with to figure out if they're legitimate or not. BBB.org is always a great resource for that, where you can see ratings and reviews on these companies to see if they're reliable, see if they're valid, see if they're legitimate. And then also too, right, just follow these basic internet safety protocols, especially when you're entering in sensitive information like your social security, your address, right? So when you're on a website, make sure it's secure by looking for that lockbox icon in the top left of the URL. And make sure that the URL of the website you're on starts with HTTPS, because of course the S in HTTPS stands for
secure.
There you go.
Also, don't do your taxes on public Wi-Fi.
Yes, that is incredibly important. If you do not own the network, if it's not your own network, if it's not your home network, you can never be sure who's running that and who can see what information you're putting in. So let's say, you're out of town, you really need to do your taxes, but you only have public Wi-Fi. Maybe switch off of Wi-Fi, use your cellular data for that. It's going to be safer because that way nobody can see your information.
Right. Yeah. Also, even if you are on your cellular data, maybe don't do your taxes in like a Starbucks where your screen is visible to people.
Right, yeah, no, people will snoop. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's countless cases of people just looking over other people's shoulders and seeing their personal information they put in, whether that's filing your taxes or, even if you're just logging into social media. Mm-hmm. People will snoop, and it's crazy what kind of information they can get from you that way. Some final tips I have for you just about the IRS and what they can't do. Again, they can't contact you by email, text, or social media, especially if they're trying to request personal or financial information. If you see that, shut them down. Don't talk to them, because that's a scammer. Also, keep in mind, too, they're not going to call taxpayers and make threats of lawsuits and arrests. That's just a tactic that scammers will use, again, to create the sense of fear and the sense of urgency. So if you see that, again, ignore it. And then my final tip here is, again, the IRS is not going to call you, email you, text you to request your identity protection PIN. That's only something that you should know, and the IRS is not going to ask for that.
Yep. And if you do need to do research on tax preparers or accountants, you can always do that at bbb.org. We have a great system for you to look up these businesses and see what the reviews are like on our website, if they're accredited or not, what their rating is, all that good stuff.
Right, yeah. And if you see any scams relating to taxes, make sure you report that on bbb.org/scam-tracker. That's just a great resource to use where you can find information on specific scams and also report scams yourself. Yeah. And, of course, you should always go to government agencies when you see scam activity. I'm sure the IRS does not love people impersonating them, and they want to put a stop to that.
Definitely. And the IRS, speaking of the IRS, it's a great website. The IRS's website has so much information about taxes to help you. They have that free file system, but they also just have articles upon articles about information for whatever your situation might be. So other than our website, the IRS is another great organization to look to get information on how to file your taxes properly.
Well, that's about all I think we have to cover today. Thank you guys again for tuning into this episode of The Good Guide to Business.
Yeah, follow us on social media. Our social medias are all at BBB Carolinas now. Yes. So we got our cute new handles on everything. So go follow us on there if you don't already. And you can listen to The Good Guide on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever else you listen to podcasts. We release episodes 2 times a month on Wednesday.
All right. Well, stay safe, you guys, and we will see you next time.